Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Elizabeth Gessel, and I'm the Director of Public Programs at Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco. MoAD is a contemporary art museum, and our exhibitions and programming inspire learning through the global lens of the African diaspora. As we begin all of our programs, we like to ground ourselves in the spaces we are occupying. As many of us are settlers, immigrants, or descendants of those forcibly brought to this continent, our institutions were founded upon the exclusions and erasures of the indigenous peoples on whose land we are located. MoAD occupies the unceded land of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, and we pay our respects to the Ohlone peoples and their elders, both past and present, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We encourage everyone to learn more about the native lands you occupy by visiting native-land.ca. I welcome you today to the program series African Diaspora Film Club, occurring monthly with Cornelius Moore, who is the co-director of California Newsreel, the 53-year-old social issue nonprofit film distribution and production company. He is also an independent film curator specializing in works from and about the Black world. I also want to thank Black Public Media for co-sponsoring this series. Today we will be discussing the documentary Revolution from Afar, and joining us is director Bentley Brown. Bentley Brown began making films while growing up in Chad, working frequently in Arabic and French on the subjects of international migration, third culture identity, and belonging. His past films include Ustaz from 2016, First Feature from 2019, and Revolution from Afar 2022. Brown recently completed a PhD in Emergent Technologies and Media Art Practices at the University of Colorado Boulder. We encourage everyone to participate today by making comments and sharing reactions in the chat and submitting questions through the Q&A box. And please take a moment to type where you are joining us from in the chat, because we love finding the diaspora in our audience. And I'll turn it over to you, Cornelius and Bentley.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, and welcome everybody to this event, and welcome Bentley. Thank you for your film Revolution from Afar, and congratulations on getting your PhD. That's a big thing too. So I wanted to begin to talking about you and your trajectory. You brought up in Texas, right? But you wound up growing up in Chad and other places on the African continent and in the Middle East. So tell us about that origin.
Yeah, so I thank you, by the way, everyone here. I'm really excited to be joining on this event of the African Diaspora Film Club with MoAD. I have not visited in person yet, but it is great to visit virtually today. I was born in the US to parents from Texas. My dad is a doctor, my mom's an engineer, and when I was around 9, they told us that we would be moving to Chad in Northern Africa, where my dad would be working as a sort of medical missionary doctor. So nonprofit work. Chad had a very big health need. There was particularly a really bad ratio of doctors to patients. So healthcare providers to people was something like 1 to some plus over 100,000. So we moved to Chad actually at the beginning. I remember accompanying my dad a bit on all kinds of medical work. So he did stuff alongside UNICEF's polio vaccination campaign, Médecins Sans Frontières, the Doctors Without Borders, as well as just working out of his own dispensary and clinic. So that's what moved us to Chad. And from that point, that's kind of where I had this massive identity transformation happened there. I arrived assuming I would learn French because French seemed to be easier and closer to English, but quickly realized that Arabic was the lingua franca in N'Djamena, where we first moved to. And so I started learning Arabic day one.
Mm-hmm. What years are we talking about?
This is at the end of the 90s. Yeah, so 1999, very end of the 90s. Yep.
Okay. So you speak Chadian Arabic, and other Arabics, right?
Yeah, and so chatting Arabic. Yeah, I happen to be wearing this Georgetown Doha shirt today. I've been living in the Gulf a little bit. Before starting my PhD, I was actually in Saudi Arabia, and uh, every time I move between Arabic-speaking parts of the world, I try to adapt to the dialect that's spoken in that place. And one of the reasons for that, beyond just better communication, is the fact that chatting Arabic is kind of a fringe dialect. It's even most Arabic speakers don't even know that Arabic is spoken in Chad. So me, myself, a lot of Chadian friends I've met abroad, so the Chadian diaspora in the Arab world, are often adapting to a local dialect and having to sort of perform in that dialect to be understood, because there's just not much familiarity with chatting Arabic.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, just for people who don't know Arabic, and I'm one of them, the different Arabics are really different from each other.
Precisely, yeah, super different. Yeah, I think you're a Portuguese speaker, and you have the whole wide range of countries in which Portuguese is spoken. But I imagine there's quite a bit of difference in those dialects as well. And with Arabic, so much that people joke about it, but someone coming from Syria, Chad, Morocco, maybe Iraq, all in the same room would have difficulties understanding each other.
And I'm going to ask you about Saudi Arabia, because you mentioned in your CV that you taught at a institution for women, and I read that, and it's like, you taught at the institution for women. How did that work, given that there's gender segregation?
Yeah, so Saudi Arabia is a really interesting place. It carries this stereotype of being the ultra-conservative Muslim, even Islamist country of the Arab/Islamic world. But a lot of things in Saudi Arabia are changing very rapidly right now as the government tries to improve its international image. And one of those is education. And this is actually way before the current leadership. This is maybe 1 or 2 generations ago, where Saudi Arabia began sending students outside of Saudi Arabia to study undergraduate, graduate degrees, at which point they were expected to come back and work in Saudi Arabia. And even locally, in the different universities, I guess you might say, internationalize a lot of the curricula in a sense. So there are these, a lot of these universities partner with universities outside. It's kind of a neo-colonial thing, right? Because they're like partnering with like an American-based university or a UK or Australia-based university for that credit, and then in exchange, those universities advise the curricula locally. So I was hired to teach at a women's school. It was the only one with a film program. It was the only undergraduate degree in filmmaking, but this is the time before cinemas were open. So it wasn't even called filmmaking. It was called visual and digital production. And it was through another filmmaker that I even heard about the program and was invited to come teach. And I thought I would be coming to, as you mentioned, like a gender segregated, all male college or something, maybe within the scope of a larger university. And it was the opposite. So it was a women's university, but they had for several years been employing men to teach there in addition to women.
Okay, that's all you want to say? I mean, what we can finish off of it, but I'm just curious, because what people's idea about what it means to be in a sex and gender segregated environment. What I mean, what were you able to have a class?
Well, it's that tension between, I want to say, the classroom was very comparable to other classrooms I've been in, but at the same time, there's obviously a lot of unique elements that I hadn't encountered before. I think the students had kind of this a very interesting language around the experience of making films, especially when filmmaking, just in general, is not looked upon as a profitable career. And this is changing in Saudi Arabia as we speak. There's a lot of funding for films right now, especially with the Red Sea Film Festival that's also in Jeddah. But people, it's like on top of not doing engineering or not doing medicine or not doing law, that these students were having to grapple with, also being a woman who had to fight for a lot of just the right to like leave the house so often, and on top of that to go out into society and shoot films. And shooting films, no matter where you are, is already tough. I mean, you're already sort of disrupting the daily life of whatever location you're on, and you're getting permits and getting permissions and making sure everything's sort of in order to create the space that you need to work in. But imagine if the very beginning, when I was in Saudi Arabia, there was still the hay'a, which was like the sort of like a religious police. So you had to worry about all kinds of variables and moving parts. And I had students straight up get detained by the religious police just because they were women. They were out, maybe been out with a crew that had men in it, this kind of thing. And fortunately, a lot of stuff's changing right now, but there's still a lot of that emotional baggage that people carry too. And also, the university itself was just is a fascinating place to be at, because we would wind up going around campus for classes and activities. There were still parts of campus that were sort of like women only, but there's no way for me to know that. It was like a note posted on a wall or something. So occasionally I'd be walking across campus to get to a classroom, and by accident walk down someone's hall where they didn't expect men to be, and I get shouted at and that kind of thing. It was interesting to put myself in shoes. It's kind of like, it's like definitely getting a perspective that I hadn't had being a man and navigating society as a man, never really having to assume that I'm that out of place.
Okay. All right, cool. Thanks for sharing that. But we can shift to Sudan now, and so I'm curious about that connection. When did you first make that connection to Sudan?
Yeah, so Sudan is kind of a natural connection. Growing up in Chad, Sudan was the largest cultural influencer for northern Chad, where I was. So the Arabic dialect of northern Chad and the general like mainstream Arabic dialect of northern Sudan are very similar. And in voweling, they really sound almost the same. I mean, you're going to have differences in terms of code switching. So in Chad, people may use a French word here and there. In Sudan, they may use an English word here and there. There's subtle differences like that. But for the most part, they're really, really similar. And that meant that Sudan, being a bigger country, being a country with overall more wealth, more diversity of economy, education, entertainment, meant that they were exporting sort of cultural artifacts to Chad. So a lot of Sudanese singers were famous in Chad. Sudanese stand-up comedians were famous in Chad. It was kind of funny because as a teenager, I would go into these like cassette tape shops to get, or eventually became CD shops to get, like $1 CD, burnt CD of one of my favorite musicians who's from Sudan, or even like a stand-up comedian. And when I moved to Sudan after college, after university in the United States, and I wound up meeting several of these people, because Sudan also has a society where there may be classism in a certain sense, but for the most part, we're really intermingling and they're very accessible. So you could literally be at a cafe and then run into a singer you've been listening to. So that's kind of the roots of my Sudan connection. And I mentioned my first job out of college was in Sudan. I worked there for almost 2 years. It was just so easy to come from Chad with Chadian Arabic and then adapt to Sudanese Arabic. Just super easy. And Sudan's a really fun place. I think because it's a little bit better off. And I say this ironically, given the military council and the situation right now, post-revolution or during this revolution. But it's straight up socioeconomically, it is a different experience than Chad, in the sense that there's just a lot more leisurely activities, a lot more disposable income than what I grew up seeing in Chad.
So you were following the political situation in Sudan?
Yeah. And for Revolution from Afar, the main desire to start working on something related to the revolution is when Omar Bashir was ousted after 30 years in power. And this was the result of popular protests that you could say had been going on for 6 or 7 months. You could also say that are the continuation of decades of opposition. But when Bashir was ousted, I mean, I was surprised and not surprised at the same time to find that this event was not being covered in international and especially Western media. You had to flip, even New York Times. Bashir he's been kicked out after 30 years of power. You have to flip all the way to the international section to even see like a small blurb on that. So I wanted to do something that would explore this moment in a much more nuanced way, in a deeper fashion. I toyed around with the idea of going back to Sudan during that time, but it's usually very difficult for me to get a visa. And it's even harder to get a visa when you have a suitcase full of cameras and microphones and equipment to go shoot a film. So I was like, well, if I'm feeling this sort of weirdness and anguish being away from Sudan during this pivotal moment, I really wonder what a lot of my Sudanese American friends are going through, who are actually physically cut off from Sudan during this time, and who actually have family and they have, you know, friends, lifelong friends in Sudan, who may be exposed to the violence of what was turning into this military crackdown against protesters. So that's the genesis of Revolution from Afar. Is I reached out to a lot of those friends. You know, there's not many Chadians in the U.S., so a lot of my friends that when I came back from Chad to the United States, like for college and later on, a lot of them are from Sudan. These are people that I would share a lot in common with. And so I wanted to reach out to them and see how they were navigating this time from kind of a psychological perspective. And instead of the film focusing just on the politics of the revolution, what happened is that we started leaning a lot more towards questions around identity and the very issue of trying to belong to Sudan while being cut off.
Being in the Bay Area, maybe this is specific, but I do recall on the streets that Sudanese Americans having rallies and public events and out on the streets about what was going on in Sudan. So, I mean, I do Africa-related work through the Priority Africa Network, but I did notice that, and maybe I just assumed that was happening other places in the U.S. and that would have to be acknowledged and covered, and that might be certainly naive.
Well, that's a fascinating point, that in a lot of U.S. cities there were protests organized. I was in Denver for a lot of that time, and there were protests at the Colorado State Capitol building. And this was a way for, I think people were doing it under the reason or the guise of, you know, spreading awareness, advocating for political action to help the revolutionary cause in Sudan. But at the same time, it was clearly a space for coping. You know, people are going through this trauma every day of, as they mentioned in the film, waking up to WhatsApp messages and just seeing what happened yesterday, what happened last night, you know, is someone in danger, someone disappeared. And so to come together for protests, I think that was something of a form of therapy at the same time. So a way to cope with the events that were happening. So we screened in London in November, and I went to protest there, and it was a very similar sight. And even audience members who came up after the film said, hey, if this film had been with like English accents, like British accents, we would have felt that they were just describing our experience, like part and parcel, right? Then we screened here at Georgetown, Jamat Georgetown, and Georgetown University in Doha, in Qatar, in December. And people came up after that screening and said, there are a lot of things that we share in common with the people in this film, but there's one thing that we don't share, which is the protests. Because in Qatar, they're not allowed to gather and protest. There's no like demonstrations publicly for these kind of things. So they actually missed having that, and watching other people gather and be able to do that in the film was kind of like this, I don't know, like a double whammy experience, right? Like there's just, oh my God, wow, they had that opportunity to come together even in this tough time that we locally did not have.
Well, not that they're mutually exclusive. You know, there are people who are political activists and, you know, do their expression in that way, but you largely chose to portraits of people who are spoken word artists, musicians, etc., as a way of telling the film and their stories. So, tell us about that connection and why you made that choice, and actually how you met all those folks.
Yeah. Some of them, like Rami Dawood, who's featured pretty prominently in the film, I'd known from before. So we had shot a movie, Faisal Goes West, together about a decade ago. Now we've shot some other stuff together since then. And Rami, at the time that we shot Faisal Goes West, I had met him. He was a rapper in Kansas City. So he had grown up in the Midwest of the United States. Others, Odyssey, Sinkane, also people that I had met through or during the shooting of past films. So I was aware of their work. I'd met them, we had maybe started the craft of friendship. At the same time, I noticed that not on the case of all the people I mentioned, but for Rami in particular, he's a good example of this. He had revolutionary elements to his lyrics, like in the years past. And so now that there was a full-fledged revolution and an overthrow of Omar al-Bashir's regime, he was confronted with this question of kind of like, oh, damn, like I've been giving people instruction, or not instruction, but I've been encouraging people to be revolutionary, to sort of like to, practice their rights and to demand what they deserve. And then now it comes at with the danger of actual live ammunition and confrontation by military police and stuff. So he makes some really, really interesting points in the film about the sort of weight of being in that position. And he says, speaking from his experience, that he's not in a place to give direction. So he can sort of encourage people or bring to light the elements of the revolution, but he's not in a place to give direction from afar.
And so you knew Rami, but what about the other people? Is it through the Sudanese American Public Affairs Association? And
yeah, several of years, or thanks to two events. One is the one you mentioned, Sudanese American Public Affairs Association. Farid Zain, particularly helping to organize with that. That took place in Denver, so that's where I've been based for my PhD. Another one was Khalid Al-Bih is a Sudanese, like diasporic is probably the best way to describe him. I think he grew up in Romania and then Qatar and then recently was in Copenhagen. He's what you might call a political cartoonist, an artist at large. And he put together an exhibit in New York around the time of the summer of 2019, in which many artists came together to perform as well. So one of the conversations is actually artists who were performing at that event. And that's how I met a good number of them as well, and started to craft friendships throughout this time. So yeah, there were a lot of new friends and new acquaintances made throughout the production.
Okay. So you mentioned earlier about screenings of the film outside the U.S., but I'm curious about the Sudanese American community in the U.S. reaction to the film.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say that they're the target audience for this, because for me, the questions of the sort of like third culture belonging, growing up in this liminal space of identity, struggling to stake claim to a place. For me, it's between the United States and Chad. I could say even other places I've lived, I feel a connection to. In this film, people are, Zainab, one of the artists from Denver, says she was asked in Sudan, "Are you Sudanese?" So like someone asked her while she's in Sudan, visiting family, "Are you Sudanese?" She says, "Well, of course I'm Sudanese. I'm Sudanese 100%, and I'm American 100%, and I'm both equally." And I personally have difficulty with that. I think that the classic adage of being third culture kid is that you can kind of perform and fit in everywhere, right? That you're third culture being that your parents are from a culture or a place, you move to another place with another culture, and you grow up something in the middle. You don't relate entirely to the culture of your parents or to the place in which you grow up, but you're able to sort of perform the identities of both. But for me, it's often a question of not belonging rather than belonging. Even though, I learned Arabic basically to narrow that gap between me and my friends in Chad, and to try to fit in, despite obviously physically not looking like.
Yeah, people would know that that something's up.
Yeah, exactly. Right? And I had friends. I try to get as introspective in my dissertation as I could too, and I shared some stories about this. That a friend Abdelaziz, who he kind of make fun of me. He's like, "Hey Bentley, you came to Chad and we taught you Arabic and French, but you didn't teach us any English," right? So he already had some beef with that. But he also, one night we were walking home at night and he's like, "Hey, we were teenagers." And he's like, if someone passes us on the road right now and they heard you talking, they wouldn't know that you didn't grow up here. Same thing, on the telephone or whatever. And I think that's a really interesting thing that he observed, and something that reminds me of these ideas of American normativity and like white normativity in the United States, and how people, there's all kinds of levels of cultural performativity. And that for me, Arabic was my way. It was my way to fit in. So like learning chatting Arabic was my way to sort of stake claim. So we talk about the Sudanese American audience and their reaction to Revolution from Afar. They may not be the sole target audience, but they're definitely the audience that most deeply connects to the subject matter of the film, and so many levels of language, of generational difference, of that feeling, that anguish of being an ocean away from something that holds such importance. The idea of nostalgia, the idea of of homelands that people may define differently from individual to individual, but they're seeing it discussed in the film. And I think I hope that that's really impactful and powerful.
You mentioned generations, and there is. I mean, so the focus of the films, the people are probably all under 40,
Yes,
or maybe in the 30s.
yeah.
What about I'm just curious about the people who are older and maybe more, been had more of a life in Sudan. So what their experience might be with the film.
Absolutely, yeah. And this is a question that actually I do get asked often. And people, when they see this film, they kind of make this presumption that it's a film that's going to summarize the Sudanese revolution for me, right? So it's going to give the history, it's going to give context, it's going to talk about everybody, how they're going through the revolution. And it's not that film. And it's a film that, like you mentioned, it focuses on a very particular subset, for the most part, Sudanese American, hyphenated identity, artists and activists who are at these two events gathering to sort of advocate, but also to support each other. And that's it. That's the target. That's the demographic in the film. That demographic doesn't even reflect the immense diversity of Sudan. It doesn't reflect the diversity of the Sudanese diaspora even. But I don't think that takes away from the power of the individual stories that these people are sharing in the film. But I have a lot of people that will say, hey, yeah, you didn't talk to us, the older generation, we left at the start of Bashir's regime. We've been advocating for 30 years abroad, right? Or people that even before that were politically active. And I'm like, yeah, well, that's just not that's not this film.
And they wouldn't be, well, I maybe shouldn't assume they wouldn't be doing spoken word and connected to hip hop culture, which is, runs very present in the film.
Yeah, and actually, we actually get like resistance to this. So we screened Faisal Goes West, which is a fiction, but it I mentioned it deals with a Sudanese family moving from Sudan to Texas. It's a screenplay that I wrote like a million years ago for like part of a film school application, whatever, and then we turned it into a movie. And so someone in the Q&A, this is during this conference in Denver, we screened that film as we were there during the protests. Someone in the Q&A said like, yeah, do you have any advice for having our kids, like ways that our kids can avoid hip hop and rap culture? And I was like, okay, first of all, look around this room. Like a lot of the performers here are performing in styles that would probably be called hip hop and rap. And secondly, I think that reality of cultural assimilation it's prevalent all over the world, right? Like wherever if you move your kids to America, you should be prepared that they will assimilate maybe in huge degrees to whatever culture or cultures they encounter in the place that you moved. That's a common topic.
Well, the assumption in that question is that associating with hip hop and is a mark, a bad thing, is criminalizing them and all that. So that's I mean, raising that whole bigger question. And it's associated with being Black American, that they can be, we can be Sudanese and we're going to make ourselves distinct from being Black Americans.
Yeah. And that's another conversation for another panel. But definitely Blackness was something even debated post the murder of George Floyd and the activism that became sort of global, people debating the idea of Blackness. And a lot of time it's defined in American terms. And you go to a place, where people have experienced Blackness in different ways. And yeah, there's definitely a big debate and a lot of nuances in language that are in that conversation as well. But it comes to light in the film, like the idea of the hip hop and sort of like American culture versus Sudanese, and in what ways do we distinguish those two. In the scene where there's a freestyle, it's very emergent, like freestyle rap session that happens in the parking lot of Red Rocks Park in Colorado, right? And so people are getting out of these cars. They put on this looped like Mob Deep track, and then just start freestyling. And Bayadir, who is a poet, Bayadir Muhammad Usman, she's a poet who's very present in the film as well, is in tarha. So she's in sort of like a hijab, and she's dancing, right? And she's talked about this in the Q&As afterwards, that whenever that scene comes up, she gets nervous that some uncle or some older generation person in her family is going to see that and then judge her and say these kind of like, you know, these things that are stereotyping whatever their notion of rap, hip hop culture is. But she's like, hey, I can't avoid it. Like, that's part of me. And at that scene, we were literally avoiding the protests in Denver. So we actually ethically, morally, we were like, we should be at the protests, which is what people presumably came to Denver for, to gather for. But here we are taking this break for ourselves, and people, you know, just breaking out into a freestyle rap in a parking lot. And the first impression that I had even was like, oh, that's like irresponsible, you know, like we're shedding responsibility. But then the way that we've been talking about it in Q&As and stuff, and people have pointed out that may have been needed. And that's a needed break. It's a needed rest. It's a needed refuge, and just another facet of identity. So,
and it's spontaneous. I mean, I like that.
Yeah.
That section. I got a couple questions from the chat from Bethlehem. Bethlehem. I'm sorry. What was the thought process behind making the documentary in black and white?
Great question. Get this one a lot. All right, so black and white, 3 reasons. 2 of them are good, one's very superficial. The 2 good reasons. One, aesthetically, when we're working with what are largely like boring locations. So admittedly, we shot a lot of the discussions in an Airbnb in Brooklyn, and then in a hotel conference room in Denver. That I've been reading something from this photographer at the time that was talking about like shooting in monochrome or black and white. You see geometric shapes and lines accented. So they become a little bit more visually interesting. So suddenly we have a conference room that has this like disgusting like light throw, these oval shaped lights on the wall in the back. Suddenly those actually look fairly interesting in black and white. Second reason is in terms of content. A lot of films that are categorized as documentary, or, you know, the nonfiction space, that have any relation to any African topic. And I'd be curious to see more thoughts on this too. We're talking to MoAD here as well in the film club. So, you know, there's this temptation that filmmakers take, and maybe this is for a certain audience. Maybe this is sort of a American Western gaze, a white gaze kind of thing, where you have to say, oh, look how colorful this place is, right? Like, look, oh, we're in Africa, but it's so vibrant and colorful and diverse, despite what you think. Well, who didn't assume that, you know? Like, why is that news? Like, why is that an important thing? And I wanted to actually avoid the distraction of people watching this film. Oh my God, it's so beautiful how everyone's wearing different. I actually want to privilege what people are saying here, like over some of those potential visual distractions. So it's weird. I kind of like flatten the film visually, but hopefully to elevate what's being said. And the final reason is very superficial, and it's the main one we did it, is that when we started shooting in Brooklyn, we were looking at footage on the train home. And Rami, we were staying in the same Airbnb, he turns to me, he's like, man, this would be amazing in black and white.
Okay. Interesting. And the other question from Bethlehem is, how were you able to fund this project? What insights have you gained through the creative process? I am a Tigrayan living in Oakland and working to make something similar to document the pain the diaspora is going through because of Tigray genocide in Ethiopia.
Well, first of all, thank you, Bethlehem, for these questions. And we had a screening at Georgetown University in the United States earlier this spring, and we talked at length about the similarities between the Tigrinya struggle. And I think a lot of people are feeling this, that there's this really, really important angle of things from the diasporic perspective that often gets ignored. In the case of Sudan, they had, I keep on putting this person on the spot, but there was a Sudanese filmmaker in Sudan who tweeted in the middle of the revolution, he tweeted, "Can the diaspora shut the F up?" And I was like, man, if we're laying stake to these claims that, okay, if you're in Sudan, you have a valid voice, and if you're outside of Sudan, you don't have a valid voice, that starts to break down really fast. Because, man, this guy, he may be in Khartoum, but he may not be seeing what's happening outside of Khartoum. And you can relate that to all parts of the world. I mean, like, who are we these days to be saying this voice is more important than this voice? I understand there's a responsibility, right? Like, you know, it would be kind of messed up if I have never been somewhere, or I didn't grow up somewhere, or I don't have connections to a place, and then I just have this giant, you know, truth claim through a film from Colorado or wherever it happened to be. That might be potentially harmful even, right? But otherwise, hell no. Like, let's bring in more voices. And I think for funding, there is interest around this, I believe, from programmers, at least from curators, in terms of grants. Grants can be tough. I think for me personally, I was able to get small grants from the university that I was doing my PhD at. But I have, as Bentley Brown, I don't think I've ever gotten a film grant that wasn't like from my university. So I kind of want to be a little cynical and say, look at what resources you have. You know, if you have a way to personally save money and to at least acquire basic equipment, that it's more important to start shooting and to get rolling than to sort of wait for funding. And these are stories that are pertinent right now. There's going to be more interest than you think, even, right? Like, so even getting something out, even on YouTube, can lead to things that you didn't even imagine. So that's my personal take, and I'm happy to follow up individually with people on advice of like, okay, what camera can I afford, like that kind of stuff. So, yeah, that's my personal take.
You didn't imagine that it would be acquired by Afropop Black Public Media when you started?
Oh, I had no idea. I started this thing on a $1,750 grant, which is nothing in the film world, like absolute zero. Yeah.
So good advice for Bethel Helm.
But the reason for that is the people that joined the film. I mean, right? Like, had I not gone out and sort of others like Khalid Albeh bringing other people together, I wouldn't have seen the beginnings of this energy that sort of became what the film is today. And so I'm very grateful for all the people that I met along the way. People contributed their own resources to help make this film possible. And I think that's awesome. You know, had we said, oh no, we don't have the money for that, you know, this film wouldn't have been completed.
Question about, again, I know that there is a long-standing Sudanese film industry, or at least people have been making films in Sudan for a long time. Curious about any plans or to having the film shown in Sudan, and is that possible?
Yeah, it's a great question. Our first screening was actually in person at the Sudan Independent Film Festival in Khartoum. They do amazing work. They've been active for almost, I guess, eight or 9 years now. The Sudan Film Factory. I was not able to attend that screening, visa issues again, right? So I was actually, ironically, I was in Jeddah at the time, in Saudi Arabia. I was about an hour, 10-minute flight away, but couldn't go because of visa. So we screened there in person. Since then, we haven't done any more screenings in Sudan. And the situation's pretty volatile, but I think it would be possible to do stuff like this. But I've dealt with the question of whether or not the film would be really of interest to people in Sudan, or would they kind of be like, okay, this is you guys kind of, you know, in the comfort of the diaspora, talking about these issues that people on the ground in Sudan are experiencing every single day. Maybe it wouldn't be welcome. But the feedback I've been getting from people who are in Sudan, who have seen the film either online, or they've come to the United States and seen it in person, or at some other place that we screened, is that it would actually be very encouraging for a lot of people, that it would be sort of something of a sign of solidarity, and less pretentious. That is like what I would be afraid of. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's one of the scenes that was very moving to me was the young woman who talked about arriving in
Yeah.
Sudan and going to the line for citizens, which kind of makes sense. In a sense, I'm Sudanese, but being told, well, no, you're in the wrong line. You need to go into the foreigner line. So, I mean, just for communicating what that's like for people in the diaspora to people who are in Sudan is, I think, quite powerful.
Oh, I mean, that story says it all, right? It was Khadija Muhammad, yeah, getting kicked out of the Sudanese line, arriving at Khartoum. And this person, I mean, not to put her on the spot too much, but if you watch the film, she like even dressed in a way that you'd be like, yeah, definitely Sudanese, right? So
Right.
with all those signs, all those indicators of, you know, of Sudanese identity, that her passport didn't match that. And to me, that's one of the realities of nationalism and the nation state, is that even though many view the nation state still as this like sort of progressive turn after larger authoritarian empires and other systems of government previously, it still falls short of encompassing the infinite diversity in every country. So, you know, and then like, so then like people that have these like hyphenated identities, right, or go up sort of in a hybridized identity or bicultural situation that only have one passport, it's like, oh, well, they can only be listed as that thing. I find that's like, it's a mess. You know, I wish passports were just able to dish them out, and I wish that the national borders didn't exist to begin with.
Yeah, that's a wonderful dream, and I don't think I'll see it in my lifetime. Maybe you'll see it in yours.
I don't know.
When I sent you a bunch of questions to consider, I'd seen a news report that Burham,
Mm.
the military person in the military who was in power in Sudan, made a statement saying, "Well, we're going to open this up to civilian rule." And I thought, well, I just looked at that quickly and thought, well, that's a good idea. And then later saw that activists in Sudan were very skeptical that was going to happen, or that's what they wanted to happen. They wanted much more disappearing of this, and so I'm raising that to say, what do you know about what's currently going on in Sudan?
Yeah, all I know is what I follow through news reports and through the activism and communications of friends of mine, both in and outside Sudan. And but anything that Burhan says, especially some kind of promise transitional to sort of civilian power or a handover. I think he was promising recently that the military would withdraw from the government. It just has not matched his behavior in the past. And this is someone who's been involved with that military takeover since day one of this sort of current phase. And there's already been essentially two military coups, basically under his watch. So no, I don't think that it naturally aligns even with the profile. I don't think it doesn't sound like it's something that he would even want. But that's what protesters have been fighting for, is this transition to civilian power. So formation of a government that can be led by non-military people. And I find it very admirable. I mean, these people are far braver than I am. They're out in the streets protesting week after week after week after week after week, sometimes not seeing any results, right? Sometimes the situation gets worse. And I think that that's something that's very admirable, and that they stick to there's these hashtags of, no negotiations, right? So like no compromise, like that, that they're adamant about not giving in to any effort from individuals like Al-Burhan, because in the words of these protesters, these people, Burhan, have blood on their hands. And so there's no room for compromise when the military cracked down and killed people who are protesting. There's no, you don't just turn around and say, okay, well, that was enough for now. here's civilian government back. They don't see those futures as being compatible.
And the movement, from what I can see, is civil disobedience, or just being present and everything is and non-compliance. That's the tactic.
Yeah, there's been days of civil disobedience. Yeah, organized, very highly organized neighborhood communities. It's from day one.
And the people who are in the film, I mean, who are in the diaspora in the U.S., what are they doing now? So you can give us some idea what people are doing career-wise, or also doing activism-wise in relation to this film, but also to what's going on in Sudan.
Yeah, so activism-wise, it's tough because, you know, it's been a while since the last diasporically organized protest that I've encountered. I think that it's tough to maintain that momentum against such a politically frightening situation. So I think largely people are still in the space of discussing and spreading awareness and sort of advocating. Individually, a lot of people in the film tried to go, or they did go back to Sudan at the end of 2019 when there was sort of this peaceful time period that lasted more or less like about a year and a half or something. And for several, it was this homecoming where they could perform, right? So if they're a musician, rapper, poet coming back to Sudan, for several was a chance to engage with audiences locally. But the film itself ends before that happens. And I'm actually not as interested in that return. I'm interested in the possibility of return. You know, at the end of the film, there is that hint of that some people are going back. But I'm not as interested in the return itself, because I don't think that the return answers those questions of belonging and the feeling of missing, that something's missing in that struggle to belong, that I think is pretty much a lifelong experience. So yeah, that's where I'm at. You know, a few people have moved back to Sudan, like one or two out of the film will go and spend long amounts of time there. But for the most part, everybody's still spread out.
Well, there's the Sudanese American Public Affairs Association, which was very active, years ago. Do you know if they're still active and if people are still some of the people in the film are connected with it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There are several who have been active. I know Wafa Saeed is another person who locally in Denver was working with SAPA, with that organization, and actually she's gone on to other types of organization and work outside of that. But yeah, there's this idea of connecting is really interesting, and the revolution in a lot of ways brought people together that hadn't necessarily been together, even among the diaspora. There's groups that maybe because of language or ethnic differences wouldn't have come together as much, and the revolution in a lot of ways was actually very powerful in accomplishing that.
We have a question from Afua that today, July 9th, is the day that South Sudan declared independence from Sudan. What is the response to those who are now South Sudanese to this film?
Yeah, that would be a great question to ask people who are South Sudanese to the film. And I've had some people come up and share responses. That they find a lot of the language of the film very applicable. It's kind of in that global sense, the questions of belonging. Omar al-Bashir, al-Mu'tamar al-Watani, his party, the National Congress Party. This group was active, oppressing the South for years as well. So there's a direct connection there in the film. But yeah, what I can say from the perspective of people that a more general response is that the question of the South comes up often in discussion. And there's this moment in the film where one of the slogans of the revolution was, Kul al-balad Darfur. So we're all Darfur now. And suddenly people in the Khartoum, like the political center of Sudan, were aligning themselves, at least verbally, with Darfur, which internationally has been known to have undergone targeted war, genocide, to maybe or not to crush sort of political insurgency there, but actually not really, because there's a lot of terrible stuff that happened that has nothing to do with war and just insurgency or political opposition. And suddenly people from Darfur, such as Hajar in the film, she expresses that, it was kind of weird to see that, to hear that. So, these in Khartoum, people had not really given any attention to Darfur and what had happened there, and the grievances and injustices, and destruction of villages and all kinds of stuff. And then suddenly everyone's claiming that we're all Darfur now, right? And so that's a very brilliant critique that Hajar raises in the film. And Ilaf, who I also commend for everyone for their openness and sharing in this film, Ilaf, Faradallah says, I'm guilty of that myself, that I was in the United States, people would have these Darfur protests or whatever, and I would downplay it, say, no, that's a political angle. That's not actually happening that way, because she personally maybe didn't want Sudan to have a bad image or whatever the reason was. And I myself have done that. I had the kind of the Chad angle, which is like, oh, it's another war. Right? Darfur is another war. A lot of people coming from Darfur into Chad. There's a sort of like this refugee crisis in Chad. I'm like, man, they got to like work their stuff out in Sudan. But overall, Sudan's a good place to be, There's actually a lot of ethical questions there. And South Sudan often gets brought up. People they'll bring up South Sudan, and they may dismiss South Sudan. They may say, but a lot are saying, oh man, like, if we'd had a revolution like this before the split, before the vote of secession, that maybe we could have saved a united Sudan.
So you in your bio, that you express interest in immigration and migration issues. So is that something that you want to explore in another media film project?
Yeah, in general, when I say migration, that's my word, my catch-all term. So I understand that's more used to describe economic migration, political migration, refugees, that kind of thing. Maybe a better word is mobility. And I'm very fascinated. A lot of my films have dealt with these questions of just moving between places with varying degrees of agency and the resulting identity transformation that happens. That's a big question for me. And I wish it's something that we could create more space for as we talk about identity. And for me, it's been very tough actually to be doing a PhD in American academia for the last 4 years, because I'm hearing all these sort of, there's a language built around identity now, around, power hierarchies, identity politics in general, that is like, as an observation, it's fairly accurate, right? But and when put into motion, does not do much to address the nuances of individual experience. And I think we wind up still putting people into a lot of boxes. And I'm to me, it's very obvious. A lot of people don't fit into boxes. So when are we going to develop that language, and how can we look for the future that we want and work towards it?
Okay. Is that what you're going to be? That's the thrust of your work that you're going to be exploring?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I have a film, like a feature that I'm working on, that I've been working on forever, but where I go back to home video from growing up in Chad. I kind of explore my own personal journey and that difference with that of my father as well, right? And I sort of negotiate identity through that lens. I also have a film right now that it revolves around sort of this budding cinema industry in Saudi Arabia, but also set against a personal story of heartbreak and a breakup that I went through. And in all these films, there's questions of identity and diversity of population and language and all these things. So,
thank you for that. We're almost at time for the end of the conversation, and I thank you for participating. It's been fascinating, and I want to give you the opportunity to say anything you want to say now before we sign off, or anything you want to pose to people in the audience.
Well, I'm welcoming any questions from the audience. I want to say, even as filmmakers, there's these questions of how do we navigate the film funding space and the film presentation space, and it's something that I'm seeing again and again attending festivals and, you know, participating in talks and all this kind of stuff. And Red Sea Film Festival in Saudi Arabia is one that I think would be interesting to keep an eye on, because as they're trying to improve Saudi Arabia's image, they are funding a lot of stuff. So there's a lot of films that are coming out of the African continent, in addition to, you know, the Arabic speaking world in general, and to Asia, that it would be interesting to see how they navigate that. Yeah, I don't know. That's kind of where my mind space is here. Okay. What text am I finding useful to address mobility? Yeah. Question from Petri. Okay. Yeah. All right. Hamid Nafisi's Accented Cinema. It's a little accented cinema. So
Accents, okay.
Accented, yeah. So Hamid is looking at Nafisi is looking at this question of the diasporic filmmaker that, generally speaking, he argues is accented. There's something different about them. There's something different about their work, given that move. He also goes into definitions of what it means to be away or separated from a homeland. So he talks about exilic filmmakers first and foremost. So people who have been exiled, sort of against their will from a place, and actually remarks that a lot of their film works look back at that homeland in a very sort of romanticized sense. So like they actually look back with longing, despite a possible traumatic move away or banishing almost. Then he talks about generations later, you'll have this, you know, what we call diaspora or diasporic population, which may share a lot together as a community, share a lot in common, but will have differences from the exiled filmmaker, the exilic filmmaker who sort of left, you know, first generation. And then later on, he says that people become, and that there's like this transition to kind of like a post-colonial sort of ethnic cultural space where there's sort of like a vague connection to that homeland, but that for all intents and purposes, the person identifies mostly with the place that they're in right now. So I really like that sort of stratification, although I have difference with it. I think that we skip those steps a lot. I think it's a very interesting text to look at. Otherwise, though, I look at things that aren't really even in the space of migration. So Jose Esteban Munoz's Disidentifications, which revolves around the idea of disidentifying, and he looks at queer artists who had been lumped into categories. So and he argues that, you know, as humans, we go through these stages of identification, and then we may go through a phase of counter-identification where you say, hey, I've been identified as this group over here, but actually I'm different, right? So this is my counter-identification. I actually have more in common over here. And that in that second group, in that counter-identified space, that often people still turn away and say, hey, I don't have a lot in common with the group you've lumped me in here. and then that leads to, given the idea of identity as a choice, that leads to a conscious effort to disidentify. It doesn't mean that you don't acknowledge those markers of identity in your work. In fact, a lot of these queer artists he looks at address these notions of identity in a very campy, cheesy way in their art. But the choice is to kind of say, yeah, you know, I really want to take myself out of that question.
Well, thanks. Elizabeth put links to both those books in the chat, which is great. You know, I didn't know about them. So, I mean, I think I knew about the first author. I'd heard about him, but that's great. Thank you for sharing those and for something for people to explore. So, unless anybody else has a question or comment, then I'm going to say thank you to Bentley Brown and offer you the last word.
Yeah, you asked me at the very beginning about what it's like teaching at a women's school in Saudi Arabia, and that's been on my mind. You know I can't say a lot about that, but I do remember some really cool stories. And one of my students, when we were looking at texts and sort of this like cultural theory space and art and politics and everything, we had read something from like, you know, the Frankfurt School, so like, you know, some German writer, right? And after discussing all class long, she says in class, she's like, you know, these guys, these like post-structuralists or whatever in Germany and France and UK, they're saying things that are pretty obvious. right? Like, you know, it makes sense. It's cool to talk about it, but it's pretty obvious. And I feel like I've thought about this myself before. So why do we keep on coming back to these same people, these same writers? And I love the way that she addressed that. And I think it's a great call for people to make things from their perspective of all walks of life and with whatever tools you have on hand. So if it's a film, getting access to whatever it is, like I think the people and the ideas are going to be far more important than the sort of means of production. And I really encourage people to explore that. And that includes through writing as well. So yeah, I want to leave on that moment.
Okay, great. And to challenge what what people think are the people who are the scholars, who are the know-it-alls. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
I like that.
Yeah.
Although now that you have a
Thank
PhD, you're one of the know-it-alls. Right? No, just kidding. So thank you, Bentley and Cornelius, for being here today for this talk about such a beautiful film, and it's really inspiring to hear you talk about it and talk about how personal it is to you and your life story. So thank you for being here with us today. I do want to let everyone know that our next African Diaspora Film Club will meet at our regular time next month on Sunday, August 14th at 5 p.m. To discuss the documentary President. It's looking at the first presidential election in Zimbabwe in the post-Mugabe era, and you can register for the program on the MoAD website. Cornelius will be traveling and away, so we won't be able to have him in conversation with director Camilla Nilsson, but we're very excited to have Dr. David H. Anthony, a professor of African history at UC Santa Cruz, will join us for the program. And I also just want to encourage everyone who is here with us today to take a moment to fill out the survey that I put in the chat. We love getting feedback from our audience about our programming. And it should pop up in your browser when you close this Zoom as well, so no excuse. Anyways, thank you so much, Bentley, and wish you the best of luck with your screening tomorrow at the Maine Film Festival. And we look forward to seeing more of your work.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bentley. Bye. Thanks, Elizabeth. Bye.